Thank you for joining me on the Southern Report. It's a privilege to have your company, and I'm going to bring on a friend of mine from across the pond that I'm very privileged to do. And we're going to sit down for a few minutes and have an interesting discussion. So I'm just going to bring on my friend Alex Newman. Alex, thank you so much for joining me. It is very much appreciated. How are you, sir?
Doing well. Thank you very much for having me, Mark. Great to be here.
No, not at all. As you know, there's a rumor that we have an election on this side of the pond. I don't know if you've actually heard about it.
I have heard the rumor. I hope you guys aren't using electronic voting machines. So,
No, but we're using postal votes, but we won't go down that. We won't go down that line. But very well said. Um, I know you've interviewed various people and had this discussion, which is Russia, Ukraine, and without immediately putting you on the spot, it is a subject basically I want us to discuss and within a short period of time to go across the bandwidth. Nigel Farage a few days ago got himself, according to the mainstream media, into some trouble, was accused of being a Putin apologist and stuff like that, because he raised the point that we have provoked Putin. He wasn't saying that what he did by crossing into Ukraine and declaring war was the right thing. He wasn't saying that. But what he was raising was this whole issue of provocation and a build up. And Alex, I want to hear your opinion on this. I'd like to hear your views on this, because you know that various people are coming at this in so many different from a number of different viewpoints. Your thoughts, Alex?
well, I've said from the beginning, Mark, I think they're setting us up for World War III. And I don't think Putin needs a provocation to try to destroy the Western world. I think that is the plan, and that has been the plan all along. And counterintuitively, I think we are actually hurting ourselves with what the Western governments are doing in Ukraine. For one, they're giving Putin the provocation that he needs to expand this and look like the adult in the room. And for two, we're being deceived from all angles. Pouring endless amounts of money into a corrupt regime like we have in the Ukraine is not a sensible use of money. And frankly, if the United States government was actually interested in the national security of the United States, they would be doing a lot of things different. Basically, everything would be different. And I do think we're being set up for World War III here. Now, I think, some background here on what I think Putin is doing. And by the way, I think Putin is a gangster. And I don't think you can understand him unless you understand that he was a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. And that he and Henry Kissinger, the globalist architect, New World Order mastermind recruited by David Rockefeller, was a very, very good friend of his. In fact, when Kissinger would go to Moscow, he'd get all these awards, and Putin would have military parades for him and pin stuff on him. And they'd have private dinners at each other's houses. Kissinger outlined the strategy for world order in his book, World Order. And he said the strategy was to build what he called regional orders in the various regions, modeled on the European Union, of course, or what I call the European Soviet, and then regionalize all of these regions and then merge these regions into one world order. And of course, that's exactly what Putin is doing right now. He's, of course, building the Eurasian Union out of the former Soviet states, at least the ones that didn't join the EU. He's giving the EU the pretext that it needs to further centralize power, to further integrate the militaries of the once sovereign European nations. He's even caused the Swedes to join NATO, which, I lived in Sweden for many years, and until recently that would have been unthinkable. He's got the Swiss talking about the possibility of joining NATO. So this is an effort, I think, to regionalize the world. And with all that as the backdrop, I want to go to one of the guys that I think is one of the most, if not the most important defectors to ever come out of the Soviet Union. His name was Anatoly Golitsyn, and he tried to warn the CIA and the FBI about what the Soviets were doing. They did not listen, either because of treason or because of massive levels of incompetence. You be the judge. But he made a series of very specific predictions, about 206, if I'm not mistaken. And he told the CIA and the FBI that the Berlin Wall was going to come down, that there was going to be a fake collapse of the Soviet Union, that the communists would stay in power everywhere, he outlined exactly what would eventually happen. He even named names like Lech Walesa in Poland. He said that this guy was working for the KGB and would lead a fake anti-communist revolution in Poland, which is, of course, exactly what happened. Now we've got the KGB archive documents showing that he was on the KGB payroll. His code name was Bolek. So this guy was right on the money. Out of 206 predictions, about 200 have come true to the T. And he says at the end of this process, at the end of this fake collapse of the Soviet Union, at the end of all of this, there would be what he described as a second October revolution, where the Russians and the communist Chinese would join forces to enslave the planet under a one world totalitarian system. Now, Golitsyn did not have certain bits of information that I think are crucial to building out this whole puzzle and understanding what's going on. But he did have some really important pieces that most analysts in the West did not have. So you take what he revealed, you take what we know from Anthony Sutton, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, right? The Bolshevik Revolution was literally financed by the deep state mega bankers on Wall Street and in London. Why? To overthrow the Tsarist government, enslave that entire great empire, and bring it into the controlled global system after using it as a foil to have the Cold War and all the rest of it. So we are now very rapidly approaching, I think, that second October revolution. And if these megalomaniacs are successful, they will use that second October revolution to once and for all smash the Western world, at least the Western world as we understand it, right? It doesn't mean there won't be any people left living in these areas, but the things that make the West, biblical principles, cultural Christianity, the things that really made the Western world, the worldview, the institutions, those will be utterly obliterated. And then we can move into this one world order based on these regional orders, with the EU being maybe the premier example. So that's what I see going on in Ukraine and Russia. And, whether they use Ukraine, Russia, or Taiwan, communist China, or even the Jews and the Arabs in the Middle East to start this global conflagration, I don't think matters all that much to the evildoers. Maybe they'll use all three or some combination of two out of the three. But the end goal is to kill enormous numbers of people, to use that global conflict as the excuse to finally smash what remains of national sovereignty, undermine completely the principles that created and made distinctive the Western world, Christendom, the free world, and then merge us into a totalitarian global system.
So when we use the phrase the West, Alex, are we defining that as the fact that that was the part that was left in regard to, if we refer to the Islamic armies at that time? Because we as Bible believing Christians, we go back to the book of Revelations and we see that the 7 letters to the churches, they are in now what we would call it Islamic Muslim countries. Is that a fair point that maybe we in the West forget about? We forget what we once had, and just because we've been concentrating on what we do have.
Well, Satan has been obsessed with destroying the Jews and the church for thousands of years, right? And that is not going to stop. And so one of the tools that were used, and I know I could probably get in trouble. I got to watch what I say with the UK and their hate speech rules. Yeah. But for many centuries, Islamic armies were constantly trying to conquer Europe, and that's a fact. I know truth is not a defense necessarily in your fake hate speech prosecutions, but that's a fact. The Islamic armies took over a big part of the Iberian Peninsula. They tried to march all the way and conquer France. Thankfully, Charles Martel stopped them 1,200, 1,300 years ago. They tried to march in through the other side. They conquered huge areas of the world, including a lot of the Middle East, all the way up to Constantinople, turned it into Istanbul, tried to keep going into Vienna. Thankfully, they were stopped at Vienna thanks to the courageous and brave fighting of the Poles and the Austrians. But they have never stopped, and they never intend to stop unless and until they can eradicate Christendom. And so when I talk about the West, I don't mean the West as a geographic area. I mean the West as a culture based on the light of the gospel, based on the truth of God's word. So, Scandinavia today is by many considered to be part of the West. 1,000 years ago, the Scandinavians were eating each other and sacrificing their children to demons. And I mean, they were savages. They were raiding and enslaving and raping and pillaging. It wasn't until Christianity arrived in Scandinavia that they became civilized, that they became good, decent, honorable societies, and then joined, what we call today the Western world. And so there is a vicious battle from the pit of hell to undermine all of that. And we know how this is eventually going to end, and that's encouraging. But in the meantime, I think there's going to be a lot of turbulence, and we're watching massive gains by the enemy when it comes to undermining the West, undermining the church. We see now the escalating attacks on the Jews, not just in Israel but around the world. And this is the kind of stuff that I think we're going to see more of in the days ahead. But be in prayer, be prepared, and stand firm on the truth.
Amen. Alex, could you define what you mean by a bipolar world? Because I think that goes into the beginning of your earlier statement in regard to Putin. Could you define that?
Sure. So since World War II, we've basically been living in what geopolitical analysts have referred to as the unipolar world order, right? In the aftermath of World War II, the last man standing was essentially the United States of America. This was, total destruction after the war there. Over 50% of global economic production was in the United States, even though we only represented, less than 2% of the global population. So this tiny little country, population-wise, basically dominated the world militarily, economically, diplomatically. I mean, nobody could even come close. All the armies in the world, probably by the time World War II was done, could not have taken down the United States. So that was the unipolar world order, and that system pretty much dominated for a number of generations, and we are now rapidly approaching the end of what's left of that system. The globalists have been talking now for at least a decade, probably more, openly at least for a decade, of this shift toward a multipolar world order. And what they mean by that is the United States will be significantly weakened, if not destroyed, and in its place as basically the main power center in the world will come multiple poles, and one of those will be the Kremlin. One of those will be Beijing. One of those might be Brussels for the European Union. One of those might be South Africa and the communist regime in Brazil and India. And so they're hoping to restructure the planet based on a new value system, right? No matter how much they waged war on the principles that America was founded on, those principles still stand. God gave us rights. We have the right to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness. And we didn't invent those principles, right? Our founding fathers borrowed those principles from you guys, the Magna Carta, and of course, the English Civil War, right? These are principles that come from the Bible, as they made very clear in the Magna Carta, as King Alfred made clear over 1,000 years ago. These are biblical principles that are at the core of what the West is. And those are the principles that turned America into the sole superpower. And so now we're watching the controlled demolition of the United States from an economic perspective, from a military perspective. This is being done deliberately by our own supposed leaders. They're deliberately destroying our economy. They're deliberately destroying our energy systems under the guise of climate change. They're deliberately destroying our children under the guise of critical race theory, racial justice, whatever it is. So this is the controlled demolition of the unipolar world order so that this new order can rise in its place that'll be primarily dominated by these regional governments. Everybody's talking about BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. One of the critical things to understand about this emergence of the multipolar world order is that each of the BRICS is actually the anchor in its respective region. So the Kremlin is, of course, the anchor of the Eurasian Union. The Brazilians, the Marxist regime in Brasilia, is the anchor of the Union of South American States, UNASUR or UNASUR, depending on Portuguese or Spanish. India is, of course, the anchor of the SAARC. South Africa is the economic and military powerhouse of the African Union, which is a totally artificial construct imposed on the Africans by the European Union, by the U.S. government, and by the Communist Chinese dictatorship. And of course, China is right at the heart of several of these, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, also the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, with which they have a free trade agreement. So this is the direction that these evildoers hope to move the world. And as part of that, when they talk about build back better, the implied part is that you got to destroy what exists so that you can build back better. So they're going to destroy what exists and then build back better, very likely, in my opinion, using a catastrophic global war.
Alex, your viewpoint from across the pond, and I don't know, I know you are watching the news avidly, and I don't know how much you've been paying attention to certain aspects of our election, but I would be very interested in your view of what is being portrayed in America in regard to our election, whether you're picking anything up, and what your viewpoint of what's going on over here. Just wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, I'll say I'm very saddened by what's happening to the United Kingdom, to Scotland, to Britain. It's really heartbreaking. Most of your major cities now seem to have Islamic mayors. Your prime minister is describes himself as a proud pagan. And the UK has been an officially Christian nation for over 1,000 years. It's heartbreaking to watch the decimation of what was certainly one of the greatest Christian nations that ever existed. I think at this point, people now say UK is post-Christian, right? Most people don't even describe themselves as Christian anymore. And that's going to come back to haunt you guys, right? Even the unbelievers and the pagans benefited greatly from the fact that you lived in a Christian country, because these principles benefit everybody, whether they're believers or not. It leads to security. It leads to prosperity. It leads to individual liberty. I mean, all the things that made the United Kingdom flourish. As Christianity is put into the rearview mirror, all of those things are going to, of course, fall by the wayside as well. And the UK eventually will look like other places that don't have that Christian heritage, that Christian culture, that Christian government. And you can look around the world for that. I mean, India and the Middle East offer plenty of good examples of what pagan and Islamic societies look like. It's not pretty. That's why they all want to come here, right? Because even if they're not believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, they recognize that societies based on those principles, even if they don't understand why, function better and are much more desirable places to live. So, with regards to the upcoming election, the Conservative Party over there, in my opinion, has become a joke. There's really nothing conservative. Trying to conserve the massive gains of the Liberals in the last 20 years is totally useless. So I'm excited by what Nigel Farage is doing. I wish him well. I think at this point it will take divine assistance, a miraculous occurrence to get the United Kingdom back, to bring back those principles, those values that made the UK great. But I hope people will keep fighting, keep praying. And ultimately, it's in God's hands. Even if we lose our nations, that's okay. We don't have trust or hope in our nations. Our hope, our trust is in the Lord. But it is very sad, especially for those of us who have children, to see what's happening. And you guys are definitely in our prayers. And I hope the United States will be in the prayers of our brothers and sisters in the UK, because we're not that far behind from you guys.
Thank you, and well said, Alex. And yes, you are in our prayers, because I can reflect back to you and say it breaks my heart in what I see for what's going on within the United States, especially as I have many friends, including you, on your side of the pond. And we look at, in the last sort of minute as we finish that, and thank you for this discussion, because I look at what's happening on your southern border, and just the deliberateness of this, and the concern about who are people like Mayakorkis, the Cuban. What are his politics? It seems absolutely, if you cut him open, you would see the red flag of communism throughout, disguised in a very sort of clever way, unfortunately, but also using the American taxpayers' money against you. And that in the end, there are these decisions. They have got together and deliberately doing this. In the last sort of minute, Alex, are people in America waking up to what's going on? Are they moving from the couch? And I say it respectfully. Are they turning off the sports channels to try and pay attention to what is actually happening in the United States of America?
Yeah, as far as the American public is concerned, the narrative of the establishment has totally fallen apart. Nobody believes the fake media anymore. I mean, the fake polls say 25% of Americans still believe the fake media, but you never run into these people unless you're in like New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco. I mean, anybody with a brain, taxi drivers, plumbers, waitresses, mechanics, I mean, they all know that we're living in a world filled with fraud, filled with lies, that many of the elections are rigged, etc. They may not understand the finer points of how it's happening, why it's happening, etc., but they know that we're being lied to, and that it's not just like biased news. It's completely made up, in many cases, psychological terrorism. So that's encouraging. Very, very good to know that people are waking up. People are very upset about this. You see this so clearly in the rallies, right? Trump has a rally, 25,000 people show up. Joe Biden has a rally. They struggle to get anybody beyond the staff and the security there. So the American people have woken up to this. Whether they will be able to stop this, because almost all of our institutions of power, government, media, academia, education, now military, even law enforcement, almost all of our major institutions have been captured by the evildoers who do not represent the American people, who do not have the consent of the American people. And so I think we'll know more by the end of this election. But there's no beating around the bush. Without God's assistance, America, as we have known it and loved it, will cease to exist. And so we've just got to trust God with the results and know that He is ultimately in charge.
And I echo that for the UK. Alex, I just want to thank you for your time. I know how busy you are, and I just thank you very much that we are able to have this conversation and reflect backwards, forwards of what is happening in our great nations. So, Alex, thank you very much for your time, sir. I'm gonna play us out, and I will speak to you again soon, I hope. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. It's a great honor. Thanks for all that you're doing.
Thank you.